Patricia and Gerald Hoffman had the same breakfast for 31 years. Toast, margarine. Coffee with skim milk. A banana. Gerald read the newspaper. Patricia organized the day's schedule. It was a ritual so ingrained in the structure of the morning that not doing it would have required a specific reason, and in 31 years, no reason had appeared. They had started using margarine in 1987. Not by chance. By instruction. Gerald's cardiologist had explicitly said, no butter. Butter has saturated fat. Saturated fat raises cholesterol. Margarine is the healthy alternative, no animal fat, no cholesterol, with vegetable oils. It was the medical consensus of the time. It was what all the American nutritional guides of the 1980s recommended. It was science. In 2018, Gerald Hoffman had his first heart attack. 67 years old, no smoking, no diabetes, controlled weight, regular physical activity, cholesterol within parameters in the last 10 consecutive exams. The cardiologist who treated him at St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City looked at Gerald's profile and said a phrase that Gerald memorized with the precision of someone who hears something that shouldn't be possible. Your profile doesn't justify this heart attack. And he was right. According to the conventional cardiovascular risk profile, Gerald shouldn't have had a heart attack. But the conventional cardiovascular risk profile didn't ask about the type of fat Gerald had spread on every piece of toast, every sandwich, every recipe over 31 years. The answer was in the kitchen. It had been there since 1987. And before revealing what was inside the margarine that Gerald and Patricia bought every week for 3 decades, and what science knew about this compound that continued to be sold as a health food until 2018, you need to understand a number that will change the way you read food labels for the rest of your life. 56,000. That's the number of premature deaths from cardiovascular disease that researchers at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, led by epidemiologist Dariush Mozaffarian, estimated in 2006 in the New England Journal of Medicine as attributable to the consumption of industrial trans fat in the United States per year. Not deaths from any cause. Cardiovascular deaths. 56,000 a year. In a country that was actively recommending the consumption of the product containing it as a healthy substitute for butter. 56,000 deaths a year. From a compound that was in every package of margarine, in every filled cookie, in every packaged biscuit, in every processed product that the label said cholesterol-free, and made with vegetable oils. The 2 phrases that the American food industry built up over 40 years to make trans fat seem like the exact opposite of what it was. But trans fat didn't appear out of nowhere. It was created, deliberately, with a specific purpose. And the journey from the lab where it was invented to Gerald and Patricia's breakfast for 31 years is a story the American food industry has spent decades trying not to tell clearly. Before telling that story, and it has a specific moment where everything becomes indefensible, there's something about the biological mechanism by which trans fat destroyed American arteries that no 1980s nutritional guide honestly communicated. And you need to understand that before anything else. Industrial trans fat doesn't exist in nature. Not in the form it's been consumed for decades. It's a product of partial hydrogenation, the process by which hydrogen is forced through liquid vegetable oils under high pressure and temperature in the presence of metallic catalysts, transforming unsaturated oils into semi-solid fats with greater shelf stability, better texture, and lower production costs than butter. The process of partial hydrogenation creates trans isomers of fatty acids, molecules that have the chemical structure of unsaturated fatty acids, but with a different spatial configuration, the trans configuration, which human metabolism does not know how to process as natural cis isomers. And when metabolism doesn't know how to process a molecule, it does things that familiar molecules don't do. Trans fatty acids enter the bloodstream and do 2 things simultaneously that no other dietary nutrient does at the same time. They raise LDL, the cholesterol considered harmful, and lower HDL, the cholesterol considered protective. Butter, with all its saturated fat, raises both. Trans fat worsens both vectors at the same time. It is biologically worse than the food it was created to replace. And there is a third mechanism that Mozaffarian and colleagues documented in 2006 that transformed the discussion about trans fat from a nutritional debate into an epidemiological accusation. Trans fat produces systemic vascular inflammation by altering the function of the endothelial cells that line blood vessels. This inflammation is the trigger for the atherosclerotic process that, over decades, deposits plaque on the walls of the coronary arteries and progressively reduces the diameter of the lumen to the point where a small clot is enough to produce complete occlusion. Gerald's heart attack had not been caused by high cholesterol. It had been caused by decades of silent vascular inflammation produced by a compound that had been in every slice of toast at his breakfast since 1987. And here's the fact that transforms Gerald's case from an individual tragedy into a systemic crime. The American food industry knew about it. Not in 2018. It knew in 1994. And the decision not to communicate what it knew cost, according to Mozafarian's data, 56,000 lives a year for decades. In 1994, the Nutritional Advocacy Organization Center for Science in the Public Interest, CSPI, published an analysis documenting the widespread presence of trans fat in American food products and formally requested that the FDA require the declaration of trans fat on nutrition labels. The FDA took 9 years to implement the requirement. In 2003, the declaration of trans fat on labels became mandatory starting in 2006. But the mandatory declaration was not the main problem. The problem was the threshold. The FDA allowed products with less than 0.5 grams of trans fat per serving to be labeled as OG trans fat, 0. This produced the inevitable result. The industry reformulated the serving sizes of its products to be below 0.5 grams of trans fat, declared 0 on the label, and continued selling products that contained trans fat in biologically relevant amounts to consumers who consumed them in multiple daily servings. Gerald ate margarine twice a day, in portions that, individually, might have been below the declaration threshold. Accumulated daily over 31 years, the trans fat load that had passed through Gerald's vascular endothelium was sufficient to explain what the cardiologist had said the conventional profile did not justify. But the fact that must be stated now, the fact that the FDA took 24 years to act after having access to the evidence is this. In 2013, the FDA made a preliminary determination that partially hydrogenated fats were not generally recognized as safe. The GRAS classification that allowed their unrestricted presence in food. The preliminary determination meant that the scientific evidence was sufficient to conclude that the product posed a risk to public health. The final determination came in 2015. The deadline for the complete elimination of partially hydrogenated fats from American foods was set for 2018. Between 1994, when the evidence of risk was clear enough for the CSPI to make the formal request, and 2018, when the ban went into effect, 24 years passed. During those 24 years, trans fat remained present in American products, in labels that said 0 when it wasn't 0, in margarines that were recommended by doctors as a healthy alternative to butter. Gerald was 42 years old in 1994, when the evidence was sufficient to act. He was 67 when his heart gave out. But the story of American trans fat has a specific moment that turns regulatory negligence into a conscious decision. And that moment involves not the FDA, but a meeting that took place in 1988 in Washington, D.C., between representatives of the American food industry and researchers who were beginning to document the cardiovascular toxicity of trans fats. Mary Enig, a biochemist at the University of Maryland, had published in 1978, 40 years before the ban, an analysis correlating trans fat consumption with increased cancer in American population data. The publication had generated an immediate and organized response from the vegetable oil industry, including funding for research that contradicted her data, pressure on the institution where she worked, and a coordinated campaign to discredit her methodology. In 1988, when cardiovascular evidence began to accumulate in a way that became difficult to ignore, the American processed food industry, represented by the Institute of Shortening and Edible Oils, organized a coordinated response that included funding for studies that evaluated trans fat compared to saturated fat instead of comparing it to natural unsaturated fat. The strategic comparison, trans versus saturated instead of trans versus unsaturated, produced results that seemed to indicate that trans fat was equivalent to or superior to butter, which is true when the point of comparison is butter. and it is statistical dishonesty when the relevant point of comparison is non-hydrogenated vegetable oil. Gerald and Patricia didn't know this in 1987 when the doctor said no butter. They didn't know in 1994 when the evidence began to be actively suppressed. They didn't know in 2006 when the margarine label began to say a grade of trans fat in servings calibrated to fall below the declaration threshold. They knew what the label said, and the label had been constructed to say exactly what the industry needed it to say. Gerald and Patricia's instinct wasn't wrong. They had followed the available medical recommendations. They had read the labels. They had chosen the product that the American health system and regulatory system had validated as healthy for decades. Gerald's instinct to protect his cardiovascular health, replacing butter with margarine in 1987 on explicit medical advice, had created 31 years of exposure to the compound that his 2018 heart attack revealed as the causal factor that the conventional risk profile could not otherwise explain. The solution had been the weapon. Protection had been the mechanism of destruction. And the system that had validated this protection for decades had known it was a weapon before publicly admitting it. What American medicine and food regulation learned from Gerald Hoffman, from the 56,000 annual deaths documented by Mozaffarian in the New England Journal of Medicine, and from the 24 decades between evidence and action, is that the American processed food market is large enough and capitalized enough that suppressing risk evidence is economically rational for decades, and that the regulatory instruments available allow this suppression to happen within the bounds of legality. What Gerald never received was the information that existed in 1994, that he would continue not to receive until 2018. And that, if he had received it in 1987 when the doctor said no butter, it would have changed the breakfast that he and Patricia had repeated for 31 consecutive years. Gerald survived the heart attack, with 2 coronary stents, with atorvastatin, with daily aspirin, with a diet that now avoids any processed product without reading the entire label, not just the trans fat line, but the ingredient list, where partially hydrogenated fat may still appear in reformulated products that continue to use transitional versions before full compliance with the ban. Patricia stopped using margarine. She went back to butter, the same butter that the doctor had told her to avoid in 1987. The same butter that 3 decades of American medical consensus had classified as the food that Gerald needed to replace to protect the heart that the substitute product had helped to destroy. Margarine was the solution. The solution was the poison. The difference between dietary fat that doesn't increase cardiovascular risk and dietary fat that produces systemic vascular inflammation over decades isn't the amount of cholesterol in the product, and it isn't animal or plant origin. It's the presence or absence of trans fatty acid isomers, and that doesn't appear clearly on any American label before 2006, and even after 2006 it may appear as 0 when it isn't 0. If you still use margarine or any processed product regularly, do one thing before your next purchase. Read the ingredient list, not the nutrition facts table, the ingredient list, and look for the words partially hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated anywhere. If those words are present, the product contains trans fat regardless of what the trans fat line on the nutrition facts table says. The FDA banned partially hydrogenated fats in 2018. But small manufacturers had deadlines extended, and products produced before the ban may have remained in circulation. And the term intrasterified, the transitional substitute that emerged after the trans fat ban, has a metabolic profile that is not yet fully characterized in long-term studies. The nutritional consensus changes. What doesn't change is that the information that protects you is on the ingredient list, not in the packaging marketing. Gerald learned this at the cost of 2 stents and a piece of breakfast toast that he can no longer look at the same way. But trans fat isn't the only food additive that the FDA classified as safe for decades before accumulating enough evidence for review. In the next video, the nitrates and nitrites in sausages and processed meats, which the WHO's IR classified as carcinogenic in 2015, and the reason why the American processed meat industry continues to argue that plant-source nitrates added as a natural alternative produce the same carcinogenic compounds as chemically sourced nitrates that have been regulated. The label that says no added nitrates may be the most effective form of misinformation in American supermarkets. Saurusis forus sar. Search for the following terms and studies. Daryesh Mozaffarian trans fat cardiovascular mortality 5-6,000 deaths NEJM 2006. Trans fatty acids LDL-HDL dual effect cardiovascular mechanism. FDA partially hydrogenated oils GRAS determination 2013-2015. Trans fat labeling 0.5 grams threshold FDA loophole. Mary Enig Trans Fat Cancer Correlation 1978 University of Maryland. Institute of Shortening Edible Oils Trans Fat Industry Response 1988.